immigration thing. So people, they get on social media and they post all kinds of stuff, and some people will call themselves Christians, and some people are not, and that's fine. But what, as believers, okay, how are we supposed to look at that as far as helping the poor and being kind and being generous and all the things that we're called to as believers, taking care of the needy and stuff like that, with right now all the, 7,000 or 10,000 people that are on their way here, and we have, a duty to secure our borders. Mm-hmm. How do you mesh that with being a Christian and not letting people in? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, when you start going at that from a biblical standpoint, the Bible just doesn't allow for that. The Bible talks about being kind to strangers, but Israel had citizenship, and when you were a citizen of the nation of Israel, the kings of Israel controlled the citizenship of Israel, and it's just something that you see throughout the Bible. You can't, the idea that there were no standards as far as who could be a citizen in the nation of Israel is just nonsense. You have all kinds of passages that deal with this whole thing. In fact, the whole law in the Old Testament speaks about that. And so you had people who would come in and be traveling through, and you were supposed to be kind to them, but that didn't make them a part of Israel.
Right.
And so just on the face of it, the verses that talk about being kind to strangers and that kind of stuff, that's not the idea that, we can have, 350,000 Midianites move in and take over the nation of Israel. That's not what we're speaking about. And so the Israelis had routine situations where groups of people tried to invade and do that kind of thing, and it was not allowed. And so Israel was a Jewish nation, and the people of Israel were going to follow the laws of the nation of Israel, and that's the way it's always been.
Right.
And so when you're talking about any nation, it's been like that down through the ages. In fact, nations nowadays, they don't have open borders. Mexico, for example, does not have open borders. I know that they're having a problem with people coming through, but they let them pass through and come to the United States. If we turned around and we tried to emigrate to Mexico, you can know for sure that if we didn't follow their immigration laws, we'd end up in jail or we'd end up thrown out of the country. And so when you're looking at immigration throughout the world, there's nothing wrong with an immigration law. We, as a matter of fact, from all the statistics I know, we immigrate more people than any other nation in the world, just with legal immigration.
Right.
And so, there's a fairness issue to this whole thing too. And there have been people who've been standing in line, and it's not right to take cuts. That's just the way that goes. And then on top of it, we have some other issues. I can't believe that we're even talking about this. We had 9/11, and the issues with 9/11 were people who got valid visas and then overstayed their visas. And these are the guys who were flying those planes and ran them into the two towers.
Doesn't take long to forget, does it?
Yeah, and one of the problems we have with a porous border is we don't know who's coming across that, and
sometimes we do, and it's gang members and people that are obviously here to not be a part of America.
Yeah,
is our values.
Yeah, I'm not so much worried about gang members as I am about terrorists. Lots of people on this planet want to kill off Americans, and so a government that does not control a border is not fulfilling what a government is supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be protecting the populace, and so that's a major issue with this whole thing. And so I think that Christians need to be kind to people, and I think that Christians need to be loving towards folks. But there is nothing wrong with immigration laws, and there's nothing wrong with having those kinds of standards. And at the very same time, we can help people in their countries, and that's something that historically the United States has done. In some instances, we've been way too instrumental in what's going on in other people's countries and not thinking those things through. But I have no doubt that most of that has been kind-hearted in the sense that we want to help people out. It's just how those things are implemented that's the issue. And so illegal immigration is illegal. And if we're going to have laws, we need to obey the laws, and anybody coming in needs to obey the laws too, and that's not unreasonable. And people who think that they're being spiritual by saying that they're kinder than somebody else because it's okay to disobey certain laws and that kind of thing because we want to help people out. It's just nonsense. That is not the way that countries are run. That's not the way that a civilization is run. And so things need to be done in an orderly manner, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that people that start putting a spiritual dynamic on that, it's just silliness. And don't try to do it with the Bible.
Right. They'll get on there and they'll say, well, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Jesus was a socialist, and they'll go down all that road trying to back their viewpoint. But isn't it weird how we have...
well, let me just address that really quick.
Okay.
There was a lady that came to Jesus, and she wanted her daughter to be healed. And he specifically went through a whole process with her because she was using terms that only an Israeli would use. And she said, Jesus, son of David. And he ignores her for a period of time until the disciples begin asking him to send her away. They misunderstood what he was doing. And what she was doing was trying to manipulate Jesus with terms that a Jew would use. And Jesus didn't allow it. And so famously in that interchange, he said, it's not right for me to take the children's bread and give it to the little dogs. And she goes, even the little dogs eat the bread from the table. And he goes, woman, great is your faith. And what he was doing was getting her off the whole idea of she could approach him on the basis of the same kind of approach that a Jewish person would. She wasn't Jewish. And what Jesus wanted her to do was approach him on the basis of reality. I just need some help. Will you please help me? And so, when you look at the way that Jesus dealt with people, Jesus dealing with people inside of the nation of Israel, he dealt with them differently than he dealt with the Gentiles. He still dealt with the Gentiles, but it wasn't on the same level. And there was a distinction between the way that things were done. He was sent to the children of Israel, and the Gentiles were blessed by him when he ran into them, but he was sent to the children of Israel, and he didn't allow those distinctions to be blurred. And so even with Jesus, you can't do that. So,
yeah, that's a great example. I was thinking, isn't it, we take the Bible seriously. We go verse by verse, chapter by chapter. Isn't it cool how, God sets up the standard for how we're supposed to help our brothers, and it's the church. The church is supposed to be taking care of people. And yet we live in a time where the government is trying to do that, and it just gets tweaked when you're talking about the welfare. And we've talked about this before, about how it enslaves people, but guys aren't working, and kind of breaks up the family and incentivizes them to do so based off of the benefits that they're getting. And then the one thing that government, you mentioned in the last question, that government doesn't fix everything. Well, one job that government is supposed to do is military and border security.
Right.
And we want to reverse that and kind of be the helping hand, and everybody can come on in, and then it gets messed up.
Yeah.
So whether you're talking about helping people when it's the church's job, or letting people in when we're supposed to be guarding for the people, the Bible says those things specifically because that's the way it works.
Right. Yeah. And so when I'm making the distinction talking about the distinctions that Jesus made, it wasn't that Jesus didn't help people who were not Jews. It's that he made a distinction between the Jewish nation and the Gentiles. And there was a way that he reached the Jews, and there was a way that he reached the Gentiles. He still reached them, but there was a way that it was to be done. And pretending, this woman coming in and pretending that she was, in effect, a citizen of the nation of Israel and addressing them on that level, he didn't allow it. And again, it's not that he didn't want to help her; he just didn't allow that. Because she wasn't. She was what she was, and he was what he was, and Israel is what Israel is, and so on and so forth. And so when I look at the United States is what it is, and it's again it's obviously we have laws and we have immigration laws. My family immigrated from Russia.
Really?
Yeah.
I knew that.
Yeah, and so back in the 1920s. And they had to hang out in China for 2 years. Then they had to hang out in Japan for 2 years. until they got sponsors in the United States who would guarantee that we weren't going to, basically live off the system. And then when that was the case, then my family came over and they began farming and had that whole thing. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. And so when my family came in, they were checked for disease. And there was a situation where I had a family member that almost didn't make it in. She almost got set aside because she came into the country sick. And so they quarantined her for a period of time, and until that was taken care of. And there's nothing wrong with that either. And so, this whole thing where it's just a free for all is not a good idea. And the reason it's not a good idea is because when you in our system, it's even more liberal in the sense of giving than it was back in the 1920s. And so in our system, we have a situation where literally people get their health care paid for. And this is what I mean by that. You go into a hospital, they're not turning you away.
Right.
Your health care is going to get paid for if you're sick. And so that costs something. And you have the same thing with education. You have the same thing with schooling. You have the same thing with all these different issues. And we have to have a nation. If we don't have the nation that we have, we're not going to have the ability to help anybody.
Right.
Because things are going to start coming apart. And so again, I don't see that as being a selfish situation. I see that as being a pragmatic situation. We have to have a nation. And if my family has to run well, if my family's going to have an impact on the people who are around us, we bless people, we give them things, we do stuff like that. But if my family falls apart, it falls apart. Nothing else is going to be going on. And people who don't understand that, again, they're not living in the real world, and I think that's a ridiculous position. And so you can be kind and you can be helpful and you can do it in ways that actually help. And, I've been in a number of other countries. Everybody that I've ever run into would love to live in America. Well, we can't have 7 billion people living here. That's not reasonable. And so there has to be some standards, and so they can be reasonable and they can be kind, but there has to be standards. So.
All right, I missed one when we were talking about immigration, so I want to answer it. This is from Desiree. Okay. She says, illegals or asylum seekers, I'm confused at how the caravan of people coming is being viewed in this conversation.
Well, we have no idea who's in the caravan. When you watch the news media, they're talking about asylum seekers and all that kind of stuff. We have no clue who these people are. We don't know what's happening with that. That's why when somebody wants to come into the United States, going through the process, if they go to the embassy and fill out forms, we have some knowledge of where they're coming from and why they're coming, and that kind of thing. And it would be the same thing when you get to the border, hopefully. But a lot of times what happens is people just know that if you say certain things because of United States law, that they're going to be able to basically scam the system. And that's not what we want happening. So people who are actually under persecution, we have a kind immigration law. I think that a lot of times the people who are most persecuted aren't getting paid attention to because we have a lot of this kind of nonsense going on. So there are Christians that are being slaughtered in the Middle East that would love to come to the United States. When you're talking about people from Honduras, a lot of the issues down there have to do with poverty, and there are ways to deal with that. But slaughter versus poverty are two different things. And so when I think of persecution, those would be things that I would be looking at. We need to be kind to people, but we need to be actually meeting the needs of people who are actually in need, and not just people who want to make $15 an hour rather than $5 a day. And I understand that whole thing. I used to I was a construction worker, and so I work with guys from Mexico all the time, specifically from Mexico all the time. And so love the guys, good hard workers, that kind of stuff. A lot of these guys were living in apartments with 10 guys in the same apartment. And they're sending money back to their family, and I get that whole thing. They all had green cards, all the guys that were working with me, and I get that whole thing. But they were here legally, and they were allowed to be in the country and that kind of stuff. And a guy who's going through that process, and that's a pretty intense process. And a guy who's going through that process and doing it right shouldn't be one-upped by a guy who just jumps a fence. It's not right. That's not the way that things are supposed to go.
My friends that have green cards get upset about those people because they went through the process.
Yeah, it's not fair. And so, again, we have a pretty liberal immigration policy, and I don't mean liberal in the political sense. I'm talking about in the fact that we try to be kind to people, and I don't have a problem with that. But there is a process, and I would like to know that the guys who are hopping the fence are not terrorists or drug dealers or that kind of thing. And so, I don't think there's really an issue with that. That's not something that's unbiblical.